Okay. Hi, everybody. It happens to be that this shiur is taking place during Hanukkah, so I just want to spend just a couple minutes saying something about Hanukkah before we return to our topic of the concept of the Torah being a product of revelation and the problematics of the approach of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. So we'll return to that in just a couple of minutes. But I wanted just to say something which I think is an important idea with regards to the holiday of Hanukkah that we're now in. The Talmud, when it discusses the holiday of Hanukkah, describes the events which gave rise to establishing this new holiday of Hanukkah. So the Talmud says, L'shana acheret, a subsequent year. It's not exactly clear if it was the next year or sometime a little bit later. The Jewish leadership at the time, Kva'um va'asa'um, they established and made Yamim Tovim, these 8 days of Hanukkah, as a Yom Tov, as a festival, as a holiday. And how are they to be observed? Hallel v'hoda'ah, with praise of God, Hallel. And of course, that's the reason we say Hallel, which is the series of psalms that we say, thanks to God, during the days of Hanukkah, v'hoda'ah, and thanksgiving. So therefore, that's why when we say the Amidah, the main prayer, which is found in the thrice daily services on Hanukkah, we add in the description of Hanukkah and our feeling of thanksgiving, specifically in the blessing of the Amidah, which is Modim, where we give thanks to God in general. So within that blessing of Modim, of thanksgiving to God that we say every day, we add in the story of Hanukkah. So Hallel and Hoda'ah, praise of God and thanksgiving. So I want to say something which I think is a very important idea and has great, I would say, political, scary relevance nowadays. I want to explore just a bit about this idea of Thanksgiving and, of course, its great relevance to the holiday of Hanukkah. It's interesting to note that the military leader of Hanukkah, of that rebellion, is Yehuda, right? HaMaccabee. It's the person, Judah the Maccabee, the person whose name, in fact, is derived from the word Hoda'ah, thanksgiving, gratitude. There's a whole interesting discussion, which I don't want to get into right now, why he's called Yehuda HaMaccabee, right? Maccabean. What does that word mean? Where does it come from, etc.? That's a complete mystery. Let's just say that it comes from the book of Maccabees, which is actually not part of our canon of the Tanakh, but is part of the Apocrypha. Apparently, it was a book written originally in Hebrew. There's actually 2 different books called the Books of Maccabees. The only remnant we have of it is a Greek edition, not the original Hebrew. And there we have this reference of Judah the Maccabee, Judas Maccabeus, and no one exactly knows what that means in Greek either, for that matter. So that'll be something for you to investigate in the next couple of days of Hanukkah, where you get this word Maccabee. In any case, so I think it's fascinating that these are days of Thanksgiving, and as a coincidence, perhaps, that the leader is Yehuda, which also comes from the word Thanksgiving. What I want to do is just briefly remind ourselves where this name Yehuda comes from. So, as you probably recall, when Leah is giving birth, so the Torah says something very strange. She gives birth to 3 sons, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and then the 4th is Yehuda. So after the 3rd birth, the Torah says, this is in chapter 29 in the book of Breshit, Batar Od, she gave birth again, but Teled Ben, and she gave birth to a son. She got pregnant again and gave birth to a son. But Tomer, she said, Ata hapam yilave ishi elai. Now this time my husband will probably hang around with me as opposed to the other wife, Rachel, because what an amazing wife I've been. Wow. right? Why? Ki yaladati lo shlosha banim. I've given birth to 3 sons for Yaakov. Amazing. Al kain krashmo Levi. So that's why she named the third Levi, because Levi means to accompany. So my husband's going to accompany me now because I've achieved 3 sons. So there's sort of like a sense of finality and summation with the third son. You know, my husband's really going to like me now because I've given birth to 3 sons. He's going to hang out with me, and they're going to call him Levi, which means to hang out with. So that's an informal way of translating that name. Then the next verse says, Vatarod, and she became pregnant again. Vatelid ben, she gave birth to a son. Vatomer, she said, Hapam odet Hashem. Now I'm going to thank Hashem. Al kain karashmo Yehuda. And therefore she called his name Yehuda, which means thanks. Yehuda, modeh, right? Thank you. Vatamod miledet. And then she stopped giving birth for that time. Fine. That's a very strange verse, right? I think we would like to assume that the wives of Yaakov, both Rachel and Leah, were very righteous women, even prophets, at least the traditional sort of Talmudic view of them. And for her to say, this time I'm going to thank God, and therefore I'm going to call his name thanks. She didn't thank God after the previous 3. Very strange. So Rashi, very famous Rashi, says, it's a rather cryptic, why is she now thanking God? Rashi says, Shenatalti yoter michalki. I've now received more than my portion. Me'ata yeshli lahodot. So now I should feel gratitude. So she named him Gratitude. Yehuda, thanks. So this Rashi, like many Rashis in the Chumash, is based upon a midrash. The midrash explains the following: that she's a prophetess, Leah, like Rachel, like all the great biblical characters are prophets. All of the patriarchs and matriarchs are all prophets. She knows that there are going to be 12 sons of Yaakov. They're going to constitute the 12 tribes of Israel. And there are going to be 4 women who give birth to these 12 sons. So she did higher math, 12 sons, 4 women, each one should be giving birth to 3. It's fair. And therefore, you have 12 sons. So, according to this, when she gave birth to the first 3 sons, she felt, and that's why the Torah has a sort of a sense of summation. You know, my husband's going to really like me now because I've successfully produced the 3 sons. That was my chalik, my lot. She felt a certain sense of, well, that's my portion. So I'm supposed to produce. But then, amazingly enough, the birth control didn't work, and she got pregnant a 4th time. I'm joking about the birth control. And she says, I will thank God this time. Why? Because that was the first son she had where there was no expectation, no sense of entitlement. So that's why she says, this time I thank God. Because that sense of gratitude in which there was no kernel of sense of entitlement, no expectation, that's the ultimately truthful sense of gratitude and sincere gratitude with no sense of entitlement. And so therefore his name is Yehuda, which means real thanksgiving, right? And this then tells us something about the Jewish notion of gratitude and thanksgiving, and we're interestingly enough called Yehudim, and the head of the Maccabean revolt, Yehuda. It means that we're called upon not to have any sense of entitlement. Magiali, they say in Israel. Magiali, I deserve it. I don't have to say thank you. Magiali, it's my right. Judaism says, no, we're Yehudim, not Magieli. We have no right to anything. Every breath we take is a pure gift. No expectations. Don't take anything for granted. And that's where we're called Yehudim. That's what we strive to feel in life, is gratitude without any adulteration of that gratitude by any sense of entitlement. In terms of how this relates to politics, you can use that to think about in terms of having a political system, the relationship between the government and the citizens, in which there is a sense of entitlement, or perhaps one should not have a sense of entitlement. And that's something to think about and discuss with your significant others. Okay, so that's our Hanukkah message for today. Now, last time that we met, getting back to the notion of revelation and the problematics of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, we saw that the Ibn Ezra explicitly says that the last chapter of the Torah was revealed to Yehoshua, Joshua. As a matter of fact, he even suggests when the last chapter refers to the burial place of Moshe, and it says that till this day, nobody knows exactly the place of burial. So Ibn Ezra there says explicitly, not only was that verse revealed to Yehoshua, not Moshe, but at the end of his life, because to be able to say, and no one knows till this very day, implies a sense of distance. Till this very day, it's a long time has passed. And till this day, we don't know where Moshe is buried. So if we say that that was added to the Torah by Yehoshua, it's not just Yehoshua the day after Moshe died, it's Yehoshua many years later at the end of Yehoshua's life. So, and then in addition to that, the Ibn Ezra hints, he doesn't say it explicitly, but he hints that there are 5 more places in the Torah where there are post-Mosaic additions to the Torah. And we took a look at each one of those. Yes.
Wouldn't till this very day suggest even after Yeshua? Because you're right, that comment suggests a long distance. Yeshua himself only dies 14 years. He only dies 14 years after Moshe does.
So it's a good question. I just want to distinguish between what Ibn Ezra says explicitly and what biblical scholar like Bruce Marquis could suggest, right? Perhaps one would suggest, no, it wasn't given to Yehoshua that verse. Yehoshua didn't write that verse because this idea of distance, until this very day, maybe it was Ezra. Who knows? But I just want to clarify that it's an excellent point, but Ibn Ezra doesn't go so far. He says it's Yehoshua at the end of his life, but it's a very good point. Fine. Now, we then explored how did the other Torah scholars in the Middle Ages, what did they think about what the Ibn Ezra said? After all, that's not the traditional view. The traditional view is that the entire Torah was revealed to Moshe, with the possible exception, according to one opinion in the Talmud, of the last 8 verses. Ibn Ezra is going way beyond that, suggesting there are 6 different places scattered throughout the Torah of post-Mosaic additions, and then not just the last 8 verses, but the entire last chapter of the Torah was, in fact, revealed to Yoshua, not to Moshe. So we saw Rabbeinu Bachya, who lived also in early Middle Ages. He was born in the 13th century, and he died in the 14th century, 1340 he died, also in Spain. And he strongly objects to the Ibn Ezra, and he reaffirms the traditionalist view that every word in the Torah, from in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, until the very last words of the Torah, Le'enei Kol Yisrael, in front of the eyes of Israel, that's the last few words of the Torah, this were all revealed to Moshe, not Yehoshua. And he says he doesn't understand what is bothering the Ibn Ezra, and he doesn't understand what's bothering Bruce, for that matter. Because after all, Moshe is a prophet, and God is telling him what to write. So the fact that some verses seem to be alluding to information which will only be appropriate in the future, that shouldn't trouble us at all, because Moshe is writing as a prophet. He's not describing his own personal experience. So he doesn't understand why we're undermining a fundamental article of faith, that the Torah is a product of revelation, just because there are verses which seem to allude to the future. No problem. Moshe's a prophet. He's being told by God what to write. Okay. We then discussed other reactions to the Ibn Ezra. So we saw Baruch Spinoza. So Spinoza, who got himself into a heck of a lot of trouble for what he wrote, he's writing in the 17th century in Amsterdam, and he quotes the Ibn Ezra. But he plays a little fast and loose, apparently, with Ibn Ezra, because in addition to what Ibn Ezra apparently says, and that is that there are post-Mosaic verses, Spinoza says what Ibn Ezra really meant is that Moshe didn't write the Torah at all. None of it. That there were revelations given to Moshe, but the Torah as we have it is not the book written by Moshe at all. It is a book which may contain snippets here and there of Mosaic revelation, but it comes from much later in Jewish history, and it is not Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moshe at all. So rather than simply isolating 6 post-Mosaic editions, the Spinoza claims that, in fact, Ibn Ezra really held that the whole book is not a product of revelation to Moshe. Just perhaps there's some remnants of it, but by and large, it's a book which comes from much later. Now, of course, he got into, as I mentioned, a heck of a lot of trouble for this, and he in fact was excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam for this, though our good friend Arthur informed us that maybe the real reason is because he didn't pay his synagogue dues for 2 years. So I haven't had a chance to look into that, Arthur, but I want to. That's a really fascinating suggestion. Okay. Now what I want to do is go a little bit further in Jewish history, more towards our time, to see how people relate to Ibn Ezra. Yes.
You know, later in history, Benjamin Disraeli, his father was elected against his own will to run the synagogue, wherever it was in London, I think of the name now. And when he declined because the one running it had to pay a very big amount of dues for this honor, so the father left the shul, took the kid with him, and this kid Benjamin Disraeli was later, raised as a Christian, and so a lot is connected to paying or not paying your shul dues.
Wow. This could be a PhD thesis for somebody who has nothing better to do. The implications of charging synagogue dues, the spiritual implications. Okay, fascinating. So what I want to do now is go closer to our time in Jewish history and see the reaction to the Ibn Ezra and the fallout from that, particularly in terms of how Spinoza used the Ibn Ezra. And I want to now take a look at one of the most fascinating commentators of, I would call it modern times. We're talking about Shmuel David Luzzatto. Luzzatto, famous name, but not the Ramchal, not Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, but Shmuel David Luzzatto, also Italy. Born in 1800, dies in 1865. That's almost modern, right? He actually dies the same year as Rav Kook is born, 1865. Okay, so what's interesting about Shmuel David Luzzatto, Shadal, he's called, is that he was trained academically. So he had academic training in Semitic languages, in archaeology, philology, Semitics, etc. And he incorporates that into his commentary on the Torah. However, he's definitely coming from an Orthodox traditionalist perspective in terms of his fundamental assumptions, though he uses modern tools in his analyses of the Torah, and often in a kind of polemic sense, to use tools that are being often used to undermine Torah, he uses those same tools in order to support traditional views of Torah. So I thought we would take a look at a little bit how he responds to this whole issue of the Ibn Ezra and particularly Spinoza's use of the Ibn Ezra. And I hope you have your source sheets in front of you. It's source number 4.
When he wrote, who was his target
packet.
audience? Who was he writing for?
Yeah, so he's definitely writing for now. Italian Jewry was a very kind of maybe called modern or progressive, quite assimilated into Italian society. There was an Italian Renaissance not so long before this, and so he's writing, I believe, for a generation that is very much feeling threatened by these new discoveries of archaeology and Semitics, etc., which seem to be and of course the theory of evolution, and all these things are coming into being now, which are threatening science, are threatening to traditional assumptions. And so he wants to stabilize and reinforce traditional Jewish assumptions, but again, using tools of, the contemporary academy in order to show that these traditional assumptions have basis. Okay, so let's take a look at source number 4. והנה ידוע, כי זה אחד מן המקראות שאמרו עליהם קצת מן המתחכמים שלא כתבם משה. So he points to the verses, what to be in this particular case, one of the verses, which is a post-Mosaic edition according to Ibn Ezra, and he has really fascinating language. He says, it's known that this is one of the verses that those who are mitchakmim, I just want to talk about that word for a second, the Hebrew word. Chacham means a wise person. Mitchak, this form of the word, mitchakmim, is used in a pejorative sense of those who are clever, like wise in their own eyes. It's using, for those of you who know some Hebrew grammar, the hit pa'el form, the reflexive. Wise in their own eyes. Excuse me?
Wise guys.
Wise guys, yeah. Those wise guys who say Moshe didn't write these verses. So now that's pretty interesting, because who was one of those wise guys who said that the last chapter of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, wasn't written by Moshe, it was written by Yoshua? Who's that? One of those famous wise guys? The Ibn Ezra. That's pretty amazing. So the Shadal, even though he doesn't say the word Ibn Ezra right now, seems to be not particularly supportive of the Ibn Ezra position. Aval nosfu, but Torah achar kama dorot. They were added later, after some generations. So that includes the Ibn Ezra, though it doesn't say after many generations, it says the next generation, Yoshua. But like Bruce, who wanted to suggest that these verses make more sense if you look at the Torah in this sort of naturalistic way, if you say it's not just the next generation, Yoshua, but even many generations. Of course, Spinoza particularly takes that view. V'adayin yesh lishol ma hayta kavanat mi she'osifoto u'ma ra'a lahosifo. So Shadal then makes a very interesting point. He says he doesn't really understand this notion of these post-Mosaic additions, because the people who made those additions, what was their motive in adding these particular passages? What do those passages add? To say, and the Canaanite was then in the land. You want to know how big Og was? Go look at his bed in the National Museum in Rabat Bnei Ammon. Why would someone feel later on in history that those notions are so critical that they're going to add these verses into Holy Scripture? Because it's essential that people know that Og's bed is in this particular place in the National Museum there. I'm making up the National Museum.
And don't we have an idea that every single word of the Torah and every sentence is so important you can't lessen the value of anything in the Torah?
That's what the Rambam said. The Rambam said even the most seemingly meaningless verses are full of meaning if we had the ability and the wisdom to appreciate that meaning. So the Shadal just says to suggest that these things are post-Mosaic additions, there must have been some importance, but he doesn't understand why the people who ostensibly added them would think that these are so critical that they'd be added into the Torah. So that's already his little criticism there. But then he goes on and he says, but the person that I'm really angry at, whatever I may think of Ibn Ezra, is the following. Let's read the next paragraph there. And since in this generation, the books of Spinoza have already spread out in the world, and they've been translated into French and into German, etc. Of course, just to remind ourselves, Spinoza wrote his great work in what language? Latin, right? But now everybody's reading it. You could read it in French, you could read it in German, etc. And people are even speaking the praises of Spinoza in Lashon HaKodesh. Let's just remember, 19th century, the movement of Haskalah, Jewish enlightenment, is now spreading. And these Jewish scholars are enthralled with Spinoza and basing much of their reevaluation of traditional Jewish belief upon Spinoza's writing. And these maskilim, these enlightened ones, write scholarly articles in Hebrew, singing the praises of Spinoza. And of course, out of that comes the liberal movements, particularly Reform. This is all happening. And Shadal is seeing this, and he's blaming Spinoza. And Spinoza says, well, he's basing himself upon Ibn Ezra. Oy vey. Okay? So he says, in light of what's happening, therefore, I need to address it. And he says the following. Spinoza quotes Ibn Ezra. And Spinoza makes claims about what the Ibn Ezra said. So Shadal is going to argue that Spinoza is the great deceiver, the great bluffer, who is relying upon the Ibn Ezra to say something that the Ibn Ezra actually does not say. Let's read some of those words of Shadal. He says the following. So I'm skipping now to the third paragraph. V'hinei emet ki Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra ramaz derech sod. He says it's true that the Ibn Ezra alluded to in this sort of secret way. Just bear in mind, the Ibn Ezra only explicitly says they're post-Mosaic editions in his commentary on the very last chapter of Deuteronomy, of Devarim. Other places, he says, he is a secret concerning these other 5 places. He doesn't tell you what the secret is. The reason that we know what the secret is because we learned last time the super commentary on the Ibn Ezra, the Safnat Paneach, who lived not long after Ibn Ezra, and explains the great cryptic references of Ibn Ezra, saying the Ibn Ezra, in fact, has 6 different places which are post-Mosaic editions. In any case, the Shadal says that it's true. Ibn Ezra does say that there are 6 passages which are post-Mosaic editions. He even says, Ki yesh b'Torah kitzat mikraot nosafim. Kitzat means a little, a few, right? A few, 6. That's it, right? Ach ein bechol dvarav u'bechol remizotav shum makom lachshov alav shelo ha'emin ki Moshe katav sifro. But there's no place in Ibn Ezra, Shadal says. There's no hint whatsoever that Ibn Ezra denied the Mosaic authorship of the Torah in general. It's just that there are 6 little verses scattered throughout the Torah, which are post-Mosaic. But as a general notion, the Torah is Torat Moshe. It is the Torah of Moshe. And Moshe is the prophet who received these revelations and wrote down those revelations, with the exception of 6 places. So claims Shadal. And now he actually accuses Shadal of total fabrication. How so? Uba Amrokan, the Spinoza claimed the following. I'll just summarize a little bit what he says here. You remember the Ibn Ezra had said, if you'll understand the secret of the 12, then you'll understand all these other passages. Ibn Ezra never explained what he meant, the secret of the 12. Spinoza says the Ibn Ezra referred to the secret of the 12. And the Ibn Ezra claims, Spinoza claims Ibn Ezra then goes on to explain the secret of the 12. What is that? It's not like we said. We said the secret of the 12 is a reference to the last 12 verses of the Torah. The last chapter of the Torah, which is 12 verses, was written by Yehoshua, according to the Ibn Ezra. And he does say that. He never refers to that. The Ibn Ezra doesn't say that that's necessarily the secret of the 12. We don't know what he means. The Safnat Paneach and many other super commentaries say that the secret of the 12 is the last 12 verses. Spinoza says the Ibn Ezra didn't say that. And he doesn't mean that. In fact, the secret of the 12 is a reference to the fact that according to Jewish tradition, based upon verses, after the Jewish people crossed the Jordan River, they then wrote the entire Torah on 12 stones. And Spinoza claims the Ibn Ezra is arguing the following. There is no way that the Torah, as we have it, could have been written on 12 stones. And what the Ibn Ezra is really saying, according to Spinoza, is whatever that book was, which was the Torah of Moshe, must have been a very short book, that it couldn't be written on 12 stones. In other words, according to Spinoza, the Ibn Ezra is saying the book that we now have called the Torah is not the Torah of Moshe. Whatever the original book of Moshe was some very slim book. Could have been written on 12 stones, and that's the secret of the 12. So according to Spinoza, Ibn Ezra is denying the Mosaic authorship of the Torah as we have it in total. Perhaps, like I said before, there are remnants of the Mosaic Torah in our Torah. But as a whole, it is not Torah Moshe at all. And the Ibn Ezra, according to Spinoza, holds that way. Because whatever that book was written on 12 stones, had to be very short. So along comes Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, and says, what a liar, what a faker, what a fabricator, what a deceiver, what a fraud. The Ibn Ezra never says that. The Ibn Ezra never says that the secret of the 12 is the 12 stones. Ibn Ezra actually never explains what the secret of the 12 stones is. And anybody with eyes in their head and a brain in their skull would understand it's a reference to the 12 last verses of the Torah. And if you say that, then the Ibn Ezra is saying that the entire Torah is Torah Moshe, with some very few and minor exceptions. Not like that fabricator, this Spinoza, who's saying that the secret of the 12 is a reference to the fact that the original Torah of Moshe must have been very short, and the Torah as we have it is not the Torah of Moshe.
But that's not attacking his premise. I mean, he's attacking the man and the idea, but how about attacking his point?
Okay, so if I understand you properly, are you saying that it's interesting that Shadal is not speaking philosophically right now? He's not saying, how could you deny the notion of revelation? He's attacking him technically. He's saying that the way you're interpreting the Ibn Ezra is a falsification of the Ibn Ezra's view. So it's not philosophical, it's sort of technical. Is that
Yeah,
what you're
that and the fact of, well, if the Torah was put on the 12 stones, how might the Shadal explain that? You have to answer the Spinoza's accusation.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not. So that is that an extra? Is that another question?
In a way, it's connected. It's the second part of the same.
Okay. Okay. So in fact, Shadal addresses that. Okay. He says the following, and it's actually right in front of you here, but maybe for the sake of time, and I spent a little time giving it to our Torah about Hanukkah, so they will make up for it by paraphrasing a little bit rather than just reading it all inside. So it is true that Shadal doesn't really argue theologically. It doesn't say, how could you undermine this important philosophical issue of the Torah's product of revelation? It's true. And I think the reason he does that is precisely because of the way we introduce Shadal. He's trying to show through logic and scientific, analysis, how Spinoza is off his rocker, right? Just to speak from religious dogma. How could Spinoza undermine this religious dogma of revelation? Right? That's not going to speak to anybody to argue like that, right? Because Spinoza is arguing technically. Spinoza does literary analysis to show, or to try to show, that the Torah is not Torah Moshe, and that the Ibn Ezra also didn't think the Torah was not. Ibn Ezra also claimed, or if the Spinoza claims Ibn Ezra says that it's also not Torah Moshe. So he's arguing with Spinoza in the language of Spinoza, that is, analytically. Okay. So then your second question is, well, then what's the 12 stones there? So it happens to be, and this is why Spinoza is so upset the Shadal is so upset with Spinoza, because not only did Ibn Ezra never say that the secret of the 12 stones is secret of the 12 is the 12 stones, Ibn Ezra explicitly explains what was written on the 12 stones. Ibn Ezra quotes Rav Saadia Gaon, who says that what was written on the stones was a brief selection of the most important mitzvot. That's it. So the Shadal says, look at what Spinoza did. He attributes to Ibn Ezra what Ibn Ezra didn't say in terms of the secret of the 12. And more than that, Ibn Ezra explicitly says that the 12 stones didn't contain the Torah. It contained a brief selection of mitzvot. So he feels that Spinoza has destroyed a very fundamental article of faith that the Torah is a product of revelation, based upon an utterly fallacious reading of Ibn Ezra. Okay. Now, I just want to point out, it's kind of funny saying this, in defense of Spinoza. Not that I want to defend Spinoza, but it's true that the Ibn Ezra explicitly explains that the 12 stones didn't have the Torah on it. It had certain mitzvot. That's true. But it also happens to be true that when Spinoza suggests that the allusion to the secret of the 12 is the 12 stones, Spinoza himself writes that he's not 100% sure that that's what Ibn Ezra meant, and that maybe he meant the last 12 verses in the Torah. So Spinoza himself said that it's possible Ibn Ezra didn't mean that. But here's the more important point. Spinoza says that the Ibn Ezra only gave 6 examples of post-Mosaic editions. And he claims, like we said before, that really the whole Torah is, in fact, post-Mosaic. But Spinoza then goes on, I don't have that on the sheet here, it's too long, to show you dozens of examples that the Ibn Ezra doesn't refer to, that are even more compelling in a certain way to show you that the Torah could not come from Moshe. Many, many other examples. So Spinoza's argument that the Torah is post-Mosaic in its totality, and that there originally was perhaps a small book that was the Torah of Moshe, he doesn't base himself exclusively upon Ibn Ezra. He just says Ibn Ezra paved the way. But Spinoza goes on with a literary analysis of many, many verses in the same vein of showing how they don't make sense if you see those verses coming in the time of Moshe himself. And if you're interested in Spinoza's arguments, you can look it up on the internet and read those. Now, of course, I just want to make sure everybody understands that this is not the traditional view, right? The traditional view is that Moshe wrote these prophetically. There are other ways of understanding those verses. And even if you say that they're referring to things that happen in the future, like we saw from Rabbeinu Bechaye, Moshe wrote them down, dictated by Hashem. And of course, they can refer to things that are only to be understood completely in the future.
Has any more traditional Orthodox Jew come out to try to refute Spinoza point by point in a follow-up book?
Yeah, tons. So there's a ton of literature, polemic, you can imagine, a ton of literature that tries to, combat Spinoza. What I want to do now is, for just a few minutes, is to show you at least a little bit how there are super commentaries on the Ibn Ezra which don't accept any reading of Ibn Ezra that's non-traditional. Now, I actually, in the preparation of this discussion, was in touch with a lot of Bible scholars from both sides of the fence, some that are in the academic world, which are fairly sympathetic with the Spinoza, for instance, and some coming from a more traditional perspective. And I asked them, is there anybody who reads the Ibn Ezra differently? So remember, there's 73 commentaries on the Ibn Ezra. So they pointed to one of the more popular super commentaries in the Ibn Ezra, which is very traditionalist. It's called Mechokekei Yehuda. It's a super commentary on the Ibn Ezra, Mechokekei Yehuda. So it's written by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Krinsky, lived in Lithuania, born around 1840, died sometime after 1915. We don't have the precise dates. And in his super commentary, he reads Ibn Ezra in a very different way. And I'm just going to tell you my personal impression. I don't know how you could read the Ibn Ezra in the way he reads him. And I'll give you a few examples of this. Okay, I don't mean to diss the Mechokekei Yehuda, but it's hard. As a matter of fact, in my discussions with Bible scholars, so I asked one very prominent individual who is fairly traditional in his views and a very big Tanakh scholar, about, is there anybody who interprets the Ibn Ezra in a more traditional way, in a compelling fashion? He answered, well, the Mechokekei Yehuda, but I would not call it compelling. Okay. And you'll see right away. So if you take a look at source number 5, this is the Mechokekei Yehuda. And he is trying to explain about the 12 last verses in the Torah. Let's read just a few words here. He says, Perush Hashnei Masar Psukim. What does it mean, the secret of the 12? So he interprets that phrase, secret of the 12, the way that Safnat Paneach did. That's referenced to the 12 last verses. Except for, look what he says here. Min Vayal Moshe, the last 12 verses from where it says, and Moshe went up to the mountain, right? It's the very first verse of that last chapter of the Torah. Ad Sofa, until the very end of that chapter. Shemoshe Ketavam B'derech Nuvuah, that Moshe wrote them by way of prophecy. I have no idea how the Mechilkei could say that. The Moshe wrote those verses prophetically. Ibn Ezra explicitly said in his commentary on the last chapter that Yehoshua wrote all those verses. So Hazmo Yusid said that the Ibn Ezra says the Moshe wrote them, but by way of prophecy. It's just baffling. I have just no idea of how he could say such a thing. And his arguments are in the same way that I don't know how he can say these things and reading them into the Ibn Ezra. But I want to make the following point. There are reasons, or at least puzzling hints, that the Ibn Ezra may not be as radical as he seems. Why? Remember, who was the first to suggest that the last 8 verses are not from Moshe, but from Yehoshua? The Talmud itself. Ibn Ezra, in only one place in the Torah, explicitly says that this passage is post-Mosaic. That's only with regards to the last chapter of Devarim. That's the only place that the Ibn Ezra says explicitly that this whole chapter is post-Mosaic. Now, how radical is that? Not too, because the Talmud itself already said that the last 8 are post-Mosaic. So, big deal. The Ibn Ezra suggests back up 4 verses. So the last 12 instead of the last 8. Every other instance, the other 5 that are understood by the Tzafnat Paneach and everybody else, almost, including Shadal, by the way, that they understood Ibn Ezra to be saying that they're post-Mosaic. The Ibn Ezra never says it explicitly. He just says, if you'll understand the secret of the 12, and the verse, and the Canaanite was then in the land, and the verse which says that look at his bed in Rabat Bnei Ammon, etc., then you'll understand this. Well, what's the secret of the 12 and what's this? He doesn't explain. So that's important to bear in mind. There's only one place where he explicitly says it's post-Mosaic. The other places, he just says it's a sod. It's a secret. What do you mean by that? I don't know. Yes. Who was that?
It's Danny.
Yes.
You know, if he's saying that at the beginning of Dvarim that it's post-Mosaic, and he buttresses it by giving.
Okay, wait a second. So the Ibn Ezra does not say in the beginning of Dvarim that he doesn't say it explicitly. That's where he says the famous idea of if you'll understand the secret of the 12 and the secret of all this, then you'll understand that even the beginning of Devarim is also like those. Except he doesn't say like what. So that's important to bear in mind, right? He does not say explicitly.
So where does he say it explicitly?
Only in the 34th chapter of the book of Devarim. The last chapter, that's it.
Sorry, so the last chapter.
Right,
okay.
Last chapter. So go ahead. So do you want to...
But in the last chapter, he talks about Sod HaShnei Masar, and he explicitly there does talk about...
No. So there, he actually doesn't use that phrase also, right? He doesn't say the secret of the 12. He just says this whole chapter is post-Mosaic. I'm putting it in my words. He doesn't use that phrase. That phrase is used in his comment on the beginning of Devarim.
Okay.
Okay, so that's interesting. But I'll tell you something even more interesting. This will knock your socks off. So we're going to skip just a bit. With all respect to the Mochokek Yehuda. Okay, so look in source number 11. Source number 11. This makes no sense. I'm going to show you right now. There's a verse in the Torah that says the following. This is in Breshit. Ve'ela malachim asher malchu be'eretz Edom. These are the kings that ruled in the land of Edom. Lifnei maloch melech livnei Yisrael. Before there was the reigning of a king to Bnei Yisrael. Just think about that verse for a second. These are the kings that ruled in the land of Edom. These are the descendants of Esau. Before there ruled a king for Bnei Yisrael. Let me ask you a question. Who is the first king of Bnei Yisrael?
Well, Shaul.
Shaul.
So this has to be a nevuah for the far in the future.
This verse doesn't make any sense unless you assume that the writer is writing post-Shaul. Right? He's saying those kings of Esau reigned before there was any king among the Jews. So he's writing from the perspective of Shaul and on. Now, look at the Ibn Ezra on that verse. You know what the Ibn Ezra should have said? No problem, post-Mosaic verse. That's what he should have said, but he doesn't. Look at this. There are those who say that Moshe wrote it prophetically, right? That's the traditionalist view. Any verse which seems to allude to the future, no problem. Moshe's taking dictation from God. It can refer to the future. Yitzchaki Amar B'Sifro. Someone named Yitzchaki wrote in his book. Yitzchaki, no one knows who he is. He might have been a Karaite scholar. So he quotes this Yitzchaki and he says, this Yitzchaki wrote in his book, Ki b'mei Yehoshaphat nichtava zot parsha. This verse, as a matter of fact, this whole parsha of the 8 kings was written in the time of the king Yehoshaphat. That's actually a naturalistic reading of the passage, right? It's post the establishment of the monarchy. So that's what Yitzchaki, this Karaite scholar, said. So that look what the Ibn Ezra now says about that. Achi karash mo Yitzchak. That's why his name is Yitzchak. This Karaite scholar. You know why his name is Yitzchak? Kol shomei Yitzchak lo, because anybody who will read his commentary will laugh at him. Yitzchak means to laugh. That's why he's called Yitzchak. I'll just skip a few words. V'chalila shadavar k'mo shediber al yemei Yehoshaphat. Chalila, God forbid that this passage, this in the Torah, is from the days of Yehoshaphat. Only when there's a monarchy in Israel. V'sifro ra'oi lisareif. The book of this Karaite Yitzchak is fit to be burned. Now I am mucho confused. I don't get it. If the Ibn Ezra, like the Safnat Paneach claims, is okay with post-Mosaic editions scattered throughout the Torah, or like Spinoza claims, denied the Mosaic authorship of the entire Torah, why is the Ibn Ezra explicitly here getting so exorcised about the suggestion that this verse of any verse should be naturally considered to be post-Mosaic? And these are the kings who ruled in the land of Edom before there ruled a king of the Jews. And by the way, the Ibn Ezra had to explain that verse. So you know what he says? He says, I'll tell you what that verse is about. Look at the very last line there. He says, the Amet and the truth of the matter, this is Ibn Ezra talking. sheperush lifnei maloch melech al Moshe melech Yisrael. When it says before there reigned a king, it's referring to not Jewish king later in history. It's referring to Moshe. Moshe's a king. Moshe's a king. V'chein katuv, as it says in the Torah, vayhi b'Yeshurun melech. There was in Yeshurun a king, which the Ibn Ezra says is a reference to Moshe. Moshe was a king, was a leader of the Jewish people. Now, that is not a very natural interpretation of that verse, but that's the Ibn Ezra himself who's offering that. And he's getting so upset about this Yitzchaki, he mocks Yitzchaki and says, Chalila, Chalila, God forbid that it should come around Yehoshaphat and his book deserves to be burned. If Ibn Ezra is such a revolutionary, modern scholar, as it were, of the Bible, this is not consistent with such a view. So I'm sharing that with you just to show you that, it's not 100% so clear that the Ibn Ezra of contemporary Bible scholars and of Spinoza is as radical as they make him out to be. Is that pretty clear?
Is there only one Girsa of Ibn Ezra?
No, there's several.
So
there's several, as a matter of fact.
I have to wonder about these comments, whether they're really stated by Ibn Ezra or not.
That's a good point. Yeah. So I've never heard anybody say that can't be the Ibn Ezra talking. But I can understand, if they would say it, I would understand why. But they don't. I just want to point out that the Tzafnak Paneach, who lives just not so long after Ibn Ezra, who did interpret Ibn Ezra fairly radically, not like Spinoza, but he did suggest that there are 6 examples of post-Mosaic verses. So he himself noticed the problem that why is Ibn Ezra getting so upset about Yitzchaki? So he says the following: because Yitzchaki is assuming that there's an entire narrative of the descendants of Esav, which is post-Mosaic. And so Safna Paneach says that the Ibn Ezra can't deal with. Because the Ibn Ezra's thesis is there are isolated, kind of interpretive little snippets scattered in the Torah. But to claim that you have an entire narrative embedded in the book of Breshit that's not Mosaic is going way too far, even for the Ibn Ezra. Now you might say, but the Ibn Ezra did say that there's an entire chapter which is post-Mosaic at the end. So the Tzafnak Paneach says, so that's not such a problem because that's the end of the Torah. It's after the death of Moshe. So that's not such a problem. But to say that in the midst of Breshit, there's an entire chapter of dealing about the descendants of Esav, which is from time Yehoshaphat, that I can't countenance. So you could.
I think the Shaddai referred to that, and also he had a strong point, which was if the Ibn Ezra specifically mentioned, 4, 5, 6 examples, Vaknani as Ba'aretz, then those are the examples he's talking about. He's not talking about the whole.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. 100% correct. Right. Let me just repeat that and make sure everybody understood that. So as Danny's pointing out, and I neglected to mention that, why would the Ibn Ezra bother isolating 6 verses if in fact the entire Torah is post-Mosaic? The very fact that Ibn Ezra says, oh, take a look at these problematic 6 verses shows you that those are exceptional. Those are exceptions. The Torah as a whole is Mosaic. So that undermines Spinoza's claim that Ibn Ezra says the whole book is post-Mosaic. Right? Are we talking about the same thing, Danny? Yeah. Okay. So excellent point. Fine. Now, what I want to do next week, again, this will be the last installment, is that further discussion of how you respond to Ibn Ezra. Right. So we saw Shadal, we saw Spinoza, we saw, or I should say, Spinoza and Shadal, right? And we saw Machok Yehuda, sort of. I didn't really give it much attention. You'll be rather shocked to go even more contemporary. How did Rav Kook deal with this issue of post-Mosaic editions? We'll spend our next session taking out some really interesting and difficult writings of Rav Kook, who, in Rav Kook's way, says cryptic, hard to understand things that seem rather radical. Stay tuned.